Well, I encourage you to take your Bibles out or take out a pew Bible in front of you and turn to the Old Testament book of Ruth. Also, if you're a guest here, we provide these sermon outlines that look like this. They're in the bulletin that you received when you came in. I encourage you to take one of those out. Back in April of this year, in our morning family devotional, we actually did a devotional with Alistair Begg on the book of Ruth. And I remember after going through that devotional, Amy and I were both struck at how profound the book of Ruth is and what an excellent story, true story it is. And I remember thinking then, boy, I'd like to preach through the book of Ruth sometime. Well, a few months ago, as I'm getting towards the end of the book of Exodus and my preaching calendar for the 4 Sundays of December, I just had written down Advent series. I had no idea what I was going to preach, but it was going to be a Christmas series. And then my mind went to the book of Ruth, which has 4 chapters and talks about a Redeemer in Bethlehem. How providential that we are going to talk about a Redeemer from Bethlehem in the book of Ruth during this season of Advent as we lead up to Christmas. So we're going to look at this morning chapter 3. And as I thought about preaching through the book of Ruth, there was only one hesitation I had, chapter 3. As we come to chapter 3, there are some strange cultural customs and some idiosyncrasies that are described in this chapter that, to be honest, 3,200 years removed, I'm still not sure what all of them mean and what they refer to or how they were acted out. But we're going to try our best to try to figure out what these things mean and what they are doing. They're unfamiliar to us. Things like a threshing floor. I would guess most of us haven't done much work at a threshing floor. A kinsman redeemer. A woman uncovering a man's feet as he sleeps out in the open sky. What does that even mean? And then as a response, he gives 6 measures of barley. That's very romantic. And so this is where we're going to be in chapter 3, looking at some of these interesting things. Well, in case you've missed it, let me give you a brief recap of the first 2 chapters of the book of Ruth. It starts with a family of 4 in Bethlehem, the city of David, oh, little town of Bethlehem. But unfortunately, there is a famine in the land. Food is scarce. And so the leader of this family, Elimelech is his name, he leads his family. It was an unwise and really an ungodly decision to leave the promised land of Bethlehem and to travel 50 miles away to the idolatrous pagan land of Moab. The land of Moab was constantly in conflict with the people of Israel. But he takes his family there, and it was not a good decision. By the time you get through the end of the first 6 verses of chapter 1, well, that family of 4 has 3 of them are gone. Elimelech, eliminated. The 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they also die, but before they die, they marry. They intermarry, which is against the Hebrew law, Moabite women, these idolatrous women. And then they have 3 funerals. When the funerals are completed, the women heard that God has again visited Bethlehem, which, by the way, the name Bethlehem means house of bread, and there is now food in Bethlehem. So they determined to return. Well, at least Naomi is going to return. She's got 2 daughters-in-law who are now widowed as well. Orpah says, yeah, I'll return, and then she changes her mind. She can't make the full commitment. But Ruth leaves her home, leaves everything she's familiar with, leaves her family, leaves her gods, and says, I will go with you, my mother-in-law. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. And they make the journey to Bethlehem. When they get to Bethlehem, we find that Naomi, the mother, she is bitter. She is bitter. And she says, I left Bethlehem full, and I've come back empty. As you go into chapter 2, it's the beginning of barley harvest, and that's a sign things are going to turn in a positive direction. It's the beginning of barley harvest. And as they harvest the barley, not only is it food for the widow's table, but it also sets the stage of the drama. And that is, there is going to be a romantic connection. That here is Ruth, who is a young widow, and she's going to find love in the owner of a field by the name of Boaz. And so for the next 7 weeks, as God orchestrates this connection, she is going to glean from the field of Boaz at both the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. And what they discover is that Boaz is a distant relative of her former father-in-law, Elimelech, who had been eliminated. Okay, you following? So here is this distant relative, and there's something in the Hebrew law known as a kinsman redeemer, that if you have been left destitute, that one of a relative of that person who's gone, who's died, can redeem you, can buy you back, for lack of a better explanation. And we're going to see that happen as we come. So here in that field, Boaz shows extraordinary kindness to Ruth and also to her mother-in-law, Naomi. As a result, Naomi goes from bitter to better. And that's where it brings us to our text today, which is chapter 3. And I'm entitling this message, Provision Promised. As we go through this passage today, verse by verse, there are 6 points I want to draw to your attention about the provision promised here in Ruth chapter 3 as we trace the story, the love story between Boaz and Ruth. I would encourage you to have pen in hand to jot some notes down. The letter of the day is P. All right? Here's the first thing I want to point out. Number one, I want us to see a precise plan. There is a precise plan, and this precise plan actually comes from Naomi, the mother-in-law, to Ruth, her daughter-in-law. To start, I want to just read one verse, verse 1, and I want to camp out a little bit here for a while because I think it's important, particularly this Sunday, when we have quite a few parents in the room. I want to give some modern-day, 3,200 year later application to parents in this setting. Look at verse 1. This is what the Bible says. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" First, think about it. What a change in Naomi. Again, she's gone from bitter to better. She is now no longer introspective. She is no longer self-consumed. She's now no longer just looking out for her own interests or what she wants to do. She's now concerned with Ruth, who it seemed earlier she could care less whether or not she came with her or not. Now she is looking out for Ruth's future. She's looking out for Ruth's well-being. Should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? And here's what Naomi is doing. She is living out an Old Testament practice that's repeated in the New Testament. The Bible says in the New Testament that older women have a responsibility, even an obligation to younger women. Did you know that? In fact, look at what Paul says in Titus chapter 2, beginning of verse 3. This is just part of it. Older women likewise are to train the young women to love their husbands. So husbands, if your young wife doesn't know how to love you, it's the older women's fault. Older women have a responsibility. The Bible says so, to train the younger women in how to love their husbands. And here's what's amazing. Naomi doesn't just give Ruth some ideas. You might try this. She doesn't just give her some random advice. No, Naomi gives Ruth a point by point by point strategic plan. This is how you'll snag Boaz as your husband. What engagement, what involvement from a mother-in-law to a daughter-in-law. Now, having said that, I want to pause right here. I want to spend a little bit of time camping out here on this concept of parents' engagement, involvement, activity in their children's romantic relationships. It's not a hands-off situation. It's a all-hands-on-deck situation. See, this process that we see happen in our world, in our culture today, it's very different than the way romantic relationships were engaged in for the previous 6,000 years of human history. Even when we perform Christian weddings, and I'll be performing one here in a couple of weeks, I ask this question at every wedding: who gives this woman to be married to this man? Even the Bible describes it that way. When you are given in marriage, what does that imply? Well, it's not just a bullet point on the ceremony outline, the giving away of the bride. It actually implies something, that the mom and the dad are engaged in the process of giving the girl to the boy, of participating in the woman coming to the man. But even as I say this morning, here on the cusp of 2025, that sounds very strange and archaic to our modern ears, doesn't it? That parents would have an active involvement and engagement in the romantic relationships of their children? Well, here's why. Dating and relationships have completely transformed over the last 125 years. Let me give you a little history of dating in the United States of America over the last 125 years. The term dating, as we know it today, wasn't coined until the year 1896. You can go look it up and check me on it. A reporter used that term for the first time. And here's what the term initially was thought to refer to: prostitution. Prostitution. Why? Because a man would go pick up a woman, take her out by himself, and what did he do? He paid money for her company. He paid for the meal. He paid for the entertainment. He paid for the gas in the car. And so actually in the first part of the 1900s, young ladies who were picked up for dates were arrested by prostitution vice squads. They thought they were prostitutes. Why? Because the men were paying for their company. This is not how dating functioned in the previous 6,000 years. Here's how it worked. A young man would indicate his interest in a young woman, and he would ask permission to call on her. You can go watch this in Pride and Prejudice, right? He would be known as the caller. And the caller would come to the home. They would sit on the front porch or in the living room or in the parlor, but they were never too far away from the parents. The little siblings were there, the mom was there, the dad was there, the dad's gun was there. They were all there gathered. And it was a safe, chaperoned environment. And after that happened, guess what took place in that meeting? Conversation. Imagine that. They talked. And if it was a good conversation, if the evening went well, the young man would ask for permission. Can I call on your daughter again? And he left, guess what? Alone, not with her. And he came back and he would call on her again. This is called courtship. This was courting. This is long before what we understand as dating. But here's what happened. It all changed as our society became more and more urbanized instead of rural. Something else changed, and that is people became mobile because of what's known as the automobile. As soon as the car entered the picture in the early 1900s, all of a sudden you had young men showing up at young ladies' homes, getting the woman, getting the young lady, and driving away by themselves. This never happened before then. So they're away by themselves, doing who knows what, where, we don't know. And as you progress through the 20th century, and as you go to the end of World War II, our economy begins to flourish, and this dating practice among young people begins to go and go and go. All of us in this room grew up in that society, in that culture of dating. This is new. This is a new phenomenon in human history. As you go into the 1960s, in the year 1960, the United States Federal Department of Drugs and, FDA, Food and Drug Administration, that's it. They okayed what's known as the birth control pill, 1960. And in 1960, you could have sex without any consequences. And in 1960, what is the 1960s decade known as? The sexual revolution. That's exactly what happened because of the birth control pill. You move to the end of the 1960s, into 1970, you have the women's liberation movement. We are free, we are free. 1973, abortion is legalized across the country. 1974, no-fault divorce is the law of the land across virtually every state. This is where we are today. You come to the 1980s, where I grew up, when I was dating. What was the number one channel for teenagers? MTV. I Want My MTV. And every 4 minutes, you got a new music video of your favorite musical artist engaging in promiscuous sexual relationships to a song. And this began to indicate and dictate to us this is what human relationships among young people ought to look like. You move into the 1990s, and when Al Gore invented the internet, you then had pornography, not behind the counter of a convenience store, hidden away. It's now piped into our homes, onto our computer screens. 2007, I became the pastor of this church, but something else happened in 2007, which was much more consequential to our society. The iPhone was introduced. And now every single one of us carry around a pornography apparatus in our pocket. What's worse? TikTok. Social media. I read a study today, or this past week, that said the average, not the maximum, the average amount of time that a teenager spends on TikTok every day is 4.8 hours. That's the average. There's many that spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day on brain rot, known as TikTok. So think about it. If you're a family like our family, and for the last 25 years, we have had a daily morning devotional catechizing our children in the gospel. What is 15 minutes of the Word versus 5 hours of TikTok? What's having the greatest influence on your children's formation of what is right and wrong, of what healthy relationships should look like? I think you know the answer. This is where we are today. This is our society. This is our culture. And I am just a small voice in a small place telling parents it doesn't have to be this way. You do not have to follow this pattern that the world follows with your children. Ruth, she no longer has biological parents. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, inserts herself, hear that language, she inserts herself into Ruth's life and says, okay, I'm going to take up the mantle of responsibility that a parent, a Hebrew parent, would normally have. And I'm going to not just give you some advice, I'm not just going to give you some counsel, I'm going to tell you how it should go down. Now, Ruth could have said, think about it, Ruth, she'd already been married. She knows how the dating thing goes. She knows how the marriage thing goes. She's now widowed. She could have said, okay, boomer, I know how this works. Just go find yourself a man. I'm going to find my own man. But that is not what Ruth does. Ruth is very humble, and she receives Naomi's advice and counsel. Her plan was a precise plan, but it was an unusual plan to our ears. It was an effective plan. Let's look at verse 2. Naomi speaking says this, is not Boaz, who's been providing for them, who's given them food and grain, is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Again, we're unfamiliar with this concept of a threshing floor, but here's what happened. At the end of barley harvest or the end of wheat harvest, when all of it has been harvested, they would take it all to the threshing floor where they would separate the grain husk, from the chaff. And when they worked at the threshing floor, it was something like a party. I mean, this is a bumper crop. There's been famine in Bethlehem for a decade, and now the land is producing bountifully. This is a big party as all the workers are gathering together. They're threshing out the grain. They are eating. They are drinking. They break out the karaoke machine. They are singing. They are having a party. And Naomi says, Ruth, go to the party. This is the opportune time for you to engage with Boaz. How does she need to get ready? She tells her, this is what you need to do to get ready. Look at verse 3. Wash. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your clothes, your nice little outfit. Go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. Here comes the strange part. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. I've never counseled any of my daughters to do this in their dating relationships, all right? Again, a different culture. But this is what Naomi tells Ruth to do. What is going on here? First of all, she says, go wash. You smelleth. Go take a bath. Put on some perfume. I mean, the only time Boaz has ever seen you, you look like a woman who's been working in the field because you're a woman who's been working in the field. Clean yourself up some. Doll yourself up a little bit. Look nice. Put on your nice clothes. Smell nice. Prepare yourself. Spruce yourself up. And there's nothing ungodly about that. And so Ruth takes Naomi's counsel. Make yourself look presentable. And then she says, wait until he eats and drinks. Interesting. Don't make your approach until after he has eaten and until he has had a few drinks in. This is ungodly. It's not. Let him relax. What happens when you eat and when you drink? When you eat, all the blood rushes from your brain to your belly, right? And when that happens, what do? You start to get sleepy. When you drink, you have some sugar. The sugar increases your blood sugar level, and you have later a sugar crash. And what happens when you have a sugar crash? You get sleepy. And so Naomi's saying, listen, there's coming a time in the course of this party, because I know how parties go at the threshing floor, he's going to eat, he's going to fill himself up, he's going to drink, and when he's done eating and drinking, he is going to be so sleepy, he's going to fall to sleep and crash. That's when you make your move, Ruth. Now, as I stand here today, I have no idea what it means for her to uncover his feet and lay down at his feet. As I've read commentators, one commentator said, well, whenever you remove the blanket and uncover his feet would become cold, and that would wake him up, and he would see her lying there, and it would startle him. Maybe. Another commentator said something basically opposite. Well, you lay next to his feet because it's a cold night, and your warm body heat keeps his feet warm, and he feels comfortable and consoled with your presence, and that just endears you to him. Honestly, I don't know what's going on here. Whatever the advice was, as we get to the end of this chapter, it worked, right? Uncover his feet, lay down next to his feet. And one thing I do want you to know is I do not believe Naomi was suggesting anything that was sexual or improper here. And here's why I know that. Look at verse 5 and 6. Verse 5, and she replied, this is Ruth replying to Naomi, all that you say, I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law commanded her. So, again, mom has a plan. Here's what you do, point by point by point. Ruth says, I will follow your plan to a T, point by point by point. And here's how I know nothing improper happened. Because when you get to the end of the chapter, you find out that nothing improper happened. Nothing sexual happened. This is just her coming to him and communicating her interest. Again, this is a culture 3,200 years removed from us. We don't really get it. And Boaz, for one, valued integrity. Boaz valued purity. So this, if it was a sensuous type of thing, he would have been turned off, not turned on, because he was the kind of man that was not attracted to that kind of a woman. I do want to say this to all the single ladies. Don't believe the lie of the world that you have to act like the world to procure a good man. You don't have to. You can live purely, wholesomely, righteously, and in fact, that's the kind of man you want to find. So that's the precise plan, all right? Let's move on. Number 2, a prompt pursuit. Ruth didn't wait around. She didn't contemplate. She didn't weigh the options. She promptly carried out the plan that Naomi had given her. Look at this in verse 7 through 9. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Literally, he hit the sack, a sack of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he asked the question all of us would have asked, who are you? Verse 7 says, his heart was merry. Some translations say his heart was cheerful. Why was his heart cheerful? They just harvested all this grain. It was a booming crop, and he had his fill of eat and drink. His heart was merry. His heart was cheerful. It's a good economic situation, and his belly is full. And as a result, his heart was merry. And the consequence is, physiologically, he was sleepy. He falls to sleep. So here he is, dead to the world, sound asleep And at that moment, she comes, uncovers his feet, and lays beside him. Some have suggested, again, different things for what she was intending here. But what I want you to understand is this. This is the pinnacle of the story. This is a high-risk situation here. Ruth has just put all her chips on the table. I'm all in. Whatever Boaz does, however Boaz responds, I don't know, but I'm just putting it all out there and saying, this is where I am. And the text says that he woke up and asked the question, who are you? Why is this a high-risk situation? She's his employee. He's the employer. She's a Moabite. He's a Jew. She's a woman. He's a man. It's the middle of the night. High-risk decision here. But she follows Naomi's advice, which leads to the next thing I want us to see. Number 3, a proposal proposed. He said, again, verse 9, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And there's another phrase that, what does this mean? Spread your wings over me? What is she talking about? Well, what she's talking about here is Ruth is hearkening back to something Boaz said in the previous chapter, in chapter 2. In chapter 2, Boaz commended Ruth. He complimented Ruth. He said, Ruth, I know your story. I know you left your family, you left your people, you left your homeland, and you came as a widow with widowed Naomi. I know your story. I know the grace that you've shown towards your mother-in-law, even though you were not obligated to do so. I know who you are, and I know the sacrifices that you've made. And notice what Boaz says to his employee Ruth in chapter 2. Look at the previous chapter 2, verse 12. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, by Yahweh, the God of Israel. Here's the phrase, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. She's repeating the words he had already said to her. I've come to take refuge under your wings. What is she saying? She's saying, you remember when you prayed for me? Remember when you prayed for me in the field that I would take refuge under the wings of Yahweh, of the Lord? Well, guess what? I think you're the answer to that prayer. I'm coming to take refuge under the Lord, under your wings. I'm coming to take refuge under you. And what this is, she's saying, I want to marry you. I want you to marry me. Now, this wasn't a marriage proposal. She was proposing a proposal. She was proposing that Boaz propose marriage to her. The question is, does Naomi's plan work? The question is, does Ruth's proposal work? The answer is yes, it does work. He's willing to do it, which leads to the fourth thing I'd like to point out. Number 4, a pleasing procedure. Boaz is very pleased with Ruth's proposal that he proposed. And so he suggests a particular procedure that they will follow. There's a procedure to all of this. Reason being, he wanted to make sure it was done decently, that it was done in order, that it was done according to the customs and the laws of his people. And so Boaz, as a righteous, God-fearing man, says, I want to make sure all the procedural I's are dotted and T's are crossed. Look at verse 10. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made the last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. He's clearly pleased. What is he saying here? Saying, listen, I've already remarked about your kindness, how you showed kindness to your mother-in-law, how you came with her. I've already remarked about that. But this kindness now is greater than the other kindness. Why? Because here I'm a middle-aged dude. You could have gone after younger men, much better looking men, much more viral men, but you chose to come after me and make this proposal. So he's very pleased with what she says. Now look at verse 11. He continues to speak. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a Redeemer nearer than I. Verse 13, remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, that's the Redeemer who's nearer relation, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So Boaz lays out this procedure that he says, I'm going to follow this step-by-step procedure in order to propose this marriage to you. What is the procedure? Well, in the legal world, this is known as an ROFL, right of first refusal. This is a clause that's sometimes put in real estate contracts. That you sell a piece of property, and when you sell that piece of property, as a part of that real estate contract, you put in an ROFL clause, the right of first refusal. And what that says is this: the person you're selling it to, when they go to sell it in the future, they find a third party to sell it to, they agree upon a price, then you come in as the original owner, you say, you are able to, because of the ROFL clause, purchase that property for the same price they agreed upon with the third party. Does that make sense? You hold this right of first refusal. You can sell this property in the future, but I want to have the right to refuse the asking price before you sell it to someone else. And so this is exactly what Boaz is saying. Guess what? There's a nearer relative than me, and he has an ROFL clause. He has the right of first refusal. And so we're going to follow the procedure that he's going to relinquish that right before I try to take up that right and become your husband, to become your kinsman redeemer who redeems you. And this is the Old Testament law. There's a stipulation in the law that a relative could redeem a deceased person's property, buy it back, or a deceased person's spouse, a wife. And this is the law that's being referenced here. It's the right of first refusal. So Boaz gives her this instruction: lie down until the morning. Before dawn, she's going to leave. In other words, it's at midnight. It's midnight. Go back to sleep. Let's get our rest. We're going to need it tomorrow. You fall back asleep. I'll go back to sleep, and we'll take care of this in the morning. But here's a question. I just want to ask this mainly of the ladies. You think she got any sleep that night? You think she did? I mean, the heart is aflutter. She's responded by proposing to her proposal. Emotions are churning. In fact, this is not in the original Hebrew manuscript of Ruth, but in a later scribal copy, there is a notation in the margin that Ruth actually wrote a song that night. And scholars tell us it went like this: last night I didn't get to sleep at all. No. Sorry, I have to insert hit songs anytime I can. You can relate, right? The emotions, the feelings, the heart is pounding. That's what Amy said she felt when she fell in love with me. Actually, I'm the one that wrote all the love songs to her back in the day, 35 years ago. But there's a question that lingers over this chapter, and the question is this. Listen, why? Why would Boaz do this? Here is this upstanding, successful, respected man in the city of Bethlehem. Here is this pagan Moabite woman, and we know the reputation of Moabite women. Here she is, and she's offering this and proposing this. Why would he do that? Well, that leads to the fifth thing I want us to see this morning. Number 5, a previous pattern. I want you to consider that this man Boaz comes from a family that has a pattern of showing grace to those who don't deserve it. He's experienced a pattern of hiding people in the middle of the night and allowing them to escape before the sun rises. Bible students, who is Boaz's mother? You might know? Rahab. Rahab the prostitute. Here's the story. Boaz's mom, I'm sure Rahab recounted this story to her little boy again and again. As the nation of Israel in the book of Joshua is preparing to cross the Jordan River to make their conquest of the promised land, the first city they were going to come to was the fortified city of Jericho, the walled city. And they sent spies into the city of Jericho to spy it out, to see how strong their fortifications were, what their army was like, what kind of resistance they would meet when they crossed the Jordan to take out Jericho. And there was a prostitute in the city of Jericho named Rahab. She'd heard stories of how God had been with the Hebrew people over the last 40 years, how God had brought them out of Egypt with a mighty right hand, how they crossed the Red Sea, how they were strong, 2 million strong. She heard stories and she says, I want to be on the right side of history. And so she hides the spies in her home. And guess what she does? In the middle of the night, she lets them down by rope out of her window. She lets them escape before the dawn. But here's what she said. She said, guys, I want you to repay this kindness to me. When you come back into Jericho and you wipe it out, I want you to rescue me and my family from the destruction. And you remember what they told her? This is how we'll identify who you are. The same window you let us down in with that rope, we want you to tie a scarlet cord. And that scarlet cord will be a mark that you will be rescued from destruction. You will be rescued from the judgment that's coming upon Jericho. What does this harken back to? It harkens back to 40 years earlier, the Passover in Egypt, when the scarlet blood of the Lamb was spread over every doorpost, and the death angel came over, and that red cord, that scarlet blood, rescued the people from the destruction. And here is Rahab, and she says, okay, I'll put a scarlet cord, and this is a type of Christ, that everyone who is under the blood of the Lamb, everyone who takes refuge under the scarlet cord can be spared the just destruction we are all due. This is the gospel right here in the story of Boaz and Ruth. And now here in Ruth chapter 3, he has the opportunity to demonstrate this same grace and same mercy that his mother Rahab received. Like, here's what's fascinating. 1,200 years later, after Boaz and Ruth's story here, 1,200 years later, the Apostle Matthew writes his gospel account about Jesus' ministry. And he begins his gospel account before he tells of the birth of Jesus in the little town of Bethlehem. He gives Jesus' genealogy, the ancestral line. Now, normally, an ancestral line was only patriarchal. In other words, it only passed through the male genealogy. You wouldn't include a female in the genealogy unless it really enhanced your pedigree, unless it was a woman of great virtue. Look who Matthew includes in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. And Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, the prostitute in Jericho, the non-Jew, and Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth, the Moabite woman, non-Jew, pagan, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David, the king. Matthew includes 2 women, 2 non-Jewish women in Jesus' lineage, in his genealogy. Why? To tell us this truth. The grace and mercy of God is for all. The grace and mercy of God is for you. Salvation comes to us in the exact same way. We who are unworthy, we who are undeserving. Rahab did not deserve the kindness of the spies. Ruth did not deserve the kindness of this upstanding Bethlehem patriarch. But they received it, and friends, if you are a believer in Jesus today, you've received it. This is the gospel of grace and mercy being proclaimed and displayed at a threshing floor in the middle of the night. That leads to the 6th and final reality I want us to consider from this. Number 6, a patient promise. And this promise comes from the lips of Ruth's mother-in-law again. Naomi outlined at the beginning of this chapter a precise plan. I want you to follow. You follow it step by step, point by point. And now the chapter closes with Naomi giving some more important advice. Look at verse 16 and following. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me For he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. At the beginning of the chapter, Naomi's talking to Ruth and says, Ruth, this is the window of opportunity. They're having a party at the threshing floor. You got to go tonight. Doll yourself up. Get down there. Keep an eye on Boaz. When he falls asleep, you go make your move. You got to take care of business. You get to the end of the chapter, she says, hang loose. Chill out, Ruth. You just wait to see how he resolves the matter. And she says, listen, all that the man has done, listen, he's going to carry the matter out. How does she know that? Naomi knew that Boaz was saying by his words, by his actions, by his gifts of the barley, he was saying, I'm in love, and I don't care who knows it. Another Christmas reference, if you don't know it. And friends, regardless of how uncertain your future is, regardless of how difficult this season is for you, I want you to know what God says about you. I'm crazy for you. I love you, and I don't care who knows it. I mean, it's one thing for us to contemplate the general love of God, John 3:16. God so loved the world. That's true. Here's the thing. God loves little old me. And God loves little old you. How do we know that? In the same way Boaz demonstrated his love for Ruth, God's demonstrated his love for you. How so? Paul tells us in the New Testament in Romans 5, but God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. God has demonstrated his love for you in the gospel, in Jesus, in his death and burial and resurrection to pay the price to redeem you from sin, to redeem you from slavery, to redeem you from an uncertain future. And friends, because he's crazy about you, because he loves you, you can rest. You can chill out. You can wait on the Lord because he cares for you. And that leads to my last thought. Cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. 1 Peter 5:7.